Hello, David Zaritsky for the Bond Experience. Welcome back. Well, lately, a book has come out that is an absolute monolith. Look at how thick that is, just under 900 pages. But more importantly, take a look at the subject. Ian Fleming, The Complete Man by Nicholas Shakespeare. Now, I have to tell you, as I've read this book, certain questions come into mind, certain curiosities, as this channel likes to focus on. Now, we could do many things. We could just ponder these curiosities, or we could do one better. We could actually call the author and see if he could come onto the show. And lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nicholas Shakespeare. Nicholas, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for coming. And, we're going to kick this off with a very simple question, but it's one that I like to ask because it's simple, but it maybe is the most important. Why did you write this book?
Well, I'm a novelist before I'm a biographer. And about 5 years ago, I was in my own equivalent of Goldeneye, a two-bedroom beach shack on the Tasmanian coast, as far away from England as you can travel without coming home again. And I'd begun a novel, and suddenly the phone goes, it's my agent in London, saying, we have a rather interesting proposition for you. I want you to think about. The Fleming estate would like a new authorized biography, the first it would be since John Pearson's in 1966. And they'd like you to write it. Would you be interested? And I have to confess to all you wonderful Bond fans, my first reaction was slight hesitation. And I have to say, I was inclined to say no. And I asked to do some due diligence for a couple of months while I made up my mind. The reason I was hesitant is that I knew about Peter Fleming. I'd written a book about Churchill coming to power in 1940, and I'd gone to the family and I'd got diaries of Peter Fleming. He was a kind of amazing commando before commandos happened, landing as the first British officer in occupied Europe in 1940 in April, round about exactly this week. And I'd really much admired him and his writing, and his younger brother, who I'd glimpsed out of sideways glances, seemed to me a different kettle of fish. And it struck me that the moral of Ian Fleming's story, only recently, is don't run off with the wife of the owner of the Daily Mail if you wish to avoid forever after being rendered into tabloid fat. Because in a sense, it was a tabloid caricature I had of Ian Fleming, of a kind of old Etonian bounder who hits the road after whipping his wife and goes off to his club at Boodles or onto the golf course and comes back late at night having fortified himself on scrambled egg and martinis and Turkish tobacco, and crawls in up the staircase in Victoria Square past his wife's dinner party, all these smart guests like Isaiah Berlin and Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene and Cyril Connolly, who are all kind of sniggering at his book, and they wave him goodbye as he goes up the stairs, and he lies in bed, pulling the sheets over his head, trying to drown out the sniggers of these overeducated voices below, laughing at his latest Bond book. Now, that was the tabloid image I had, and I thought, do I want to spend 4 or 5 years in this man's company? And so in the next 2 months, 2 things happened. I discovered that he was a much kinder person than I'd hitherto anticipated. Again and again, the women he had affairs with, Rebecca West said they were enough to fill the Albert Hall, dear boy, talked about his kindness. And now this wasn't a characteristic I associated with the author of 007. And again, somebody like Maud Russell, who bought GoldenEye for him after the war, I managed to get hold of her unpublished diaries, and in which 7 years after Fleming dies, she writes, I think of Ian constantly above all of his kindliness. So that's quite a prize characteristic for a biographer to discover and to try and resuscitate, bring up like coral from the deep and preserve. It was also a characteristic that men, by the way, men found him very attractive too. And he had a great loyal band of old school friends, mainly, with whom he would play golf and bridge, but they were all upright figures in the mold of his grandfather, a Scottish banker, Robert Fleming. They wouldn't have been duped by a cad. Now, the second thing I found about him is that he was a lot more important than I'd imagined. My old boss, Max Hastings, wonderful military historian, can't be shifted from his position that Fleming was a kind of unimportant officer during the war, desk-bound in naval intelligence at the Admiralty, in charge of in-trays, out-trays, and ashtrays. Actually, that it more was characteristic of two other novelists, British novelists, who I actually knew. I didn't know Ian Fleming, but I did know Graham Greene and I did know John le Carré, both of whom had worked in British intelligence, but in very minor positions. I mean, Graham Greene was in Sierra Leone during the war, and le Carré was in Hamburg and never had a successful operation to his name. Fleming, by contrast, was in the inner sanctum of British intelligence. He was one of only 30 people who were cleared to know the top secrets of the war, those decrypts from Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire. He would go there every fortnight. He knew Alan Turing. It wasn't only Bletchley that he knew about. He was put in charge of things like the topographical unit in Oxford, which made papier-mâché models of the beaches in northern France for which the D-Day landings would depend. He also set up this commando unit, 30AU, which would go in advance of the troops into North Africa and Sicily and North France and Germany to try and grab the Enigma machines, code books, cipher books, send them back to Bletchley, shortening the war, some historians think, by as much as 18 months. But for an American audience, his most important contribution was in April 1941, when he goes over to New York and Washington with his boss, Admiral Godfrey, to try and persuade Roosevelt to set up a foreign intelligence organization. I mean, it's incredible to think now that in 1941, the Americans did not have a foreign intelligence organization. So the British were very keen, Churchill especially with an American mother, to bring America into the war. Fleming is one of the 2 or 3 people who are sent to create what Churchill would call in 1946 a special relationship. Well, it was essentially an intelligence relationship. And Fleming is one of the 2 or 3 people in the room creating this service with William Donovan in Washington, in Georgetown. They sit down in various houses, which I've been to, and Fleming writes memo after memo to Donovan on what an American Secret Service should look like based on naval intelligence. And Fleming's even suggesting personnel, he's suggesting how it's constructed, he's suggesting the departments. And this becomes the COI in the summer of 1941, it becomes the OSS the following year, and in 1947 it becomes the CIA. And so Fleming knew many of the people who become the heads of the CIA, like Alan Dulles, a great Bond fan. Fleming is one of those people in the room and sometimes in the bedroom when important decisions are being made. And so that also persuaded me that this man is a lot more interesting than I had hitherto anticipated. I mean, this isn't a chocolate sailor. Right at the end of the war, on top of that, he is invited to contribute to what was the Bland Report, which was to discuss the future of the British intelligence organization. And he makes contributions. He predicts cyber warfare. He predicts drones. He predicts arenas of conflict that will actually happen. And he's offered a job in August 1945. And we don't know what it is, but it's clearly quite an important job in this new organization. He's already been chairing Joint Intelligence Bureau meetings to discuss the form of this organization. Now, a chocolate sailor doesn't do that. And he also chaired, during the war, Joint Intelligence Committee meetings about German U-bombs coming in. Now, this is quite high up. None of the minutes exist. The file on him would be classified anyway, but enough survives to show that he was really quite an important functionary in British intelligence. Now, what I always found fascinating is that when he comes to write the Bond books in the latter part of his life, I mean, Bond is an afterthought of an interesting life. When his interesting life is over, it seems to me that he's trying to retrieve his bachelor self from the war, put it in a Cold War setting, all the operations he planned against the Nazis, now plan them against the Russians, put it in fiction, because he couldn't write about any of this. He'd signed the Official Secrets Act. Transfer it into fiction and actually have a kind of what seems a modern kind of thriller set in the Cold War is in fact just reheated cabbage from the Second World War based on all the stuff he knew. And it seemed to me that he was exploring through Bond the kind of person he would have been had he stayed on in British intelligence after the war. I mean, it's quite clear he would have become probably the head of the Secret Service. His brother Peter in 1952 was one of 5 people shortlisted to be the head of the British Secret Service. I think Ian would have become the head of the Secret Service had he stayed on. He doesn't. He becomes a journalist for the Sunday Times. He sets up a kind of parallel Secret Service organization using about 88 journalists around the world, many of them former intelligence officers, many of them from naval intelligence. And these are deployed to report on essentially communist operations and send back to Fleming sitreps, he called them, reports separate to the reports he would put in the newspaper, and these sitreps he would pass on to British intelligence. So he kept up a link with British intelligence, running a kind of parallel intelligence organization based possibly on Reuters, based possibly on naval intelligence. It all starts to peter out because Lord Kemsley, his boss, doesn't want to pay for it. And so that in that position, he then starts writing Bond. So I felt that too was none of this had been really, it had been suspected but not known about. So that was so 2 things persuaded me. One was he was kinder, one was more intelligent, but there was a third factor. You will know that writers are very superstitious as much as they are skeptical. And I think we become spookily receptive to the tiniest twinkle. And in my case, 2 or 3 kind of weird connections evolved in the 2 months I was doing my due diligence. One, my father, to whom I dedicate the book, had shared a desk with John Pearson in 1953 at the Times. John Pearson was the first authorized biographer. John Pearson went on to work with Ian Fleming at the Sunday Times as his assistant. My father went on to work for Frank Giles, who became Fleming's successor as foreign manager on the Sunday Times. 66 years after they shared a desk, I brought them back together for lunch. Wonderful meeting. And John Pearson kind of gives me his blessing to enter his biographical domain. And he gives me a file, the Fleming file, all the stuff he wasn't allowed to write in 1966, all the stuff he'd since discovered. That was a fantastic gift to me. There were other Shakespeare connections. My grandfather had been in the First World War at Ypres when he and Ian Fleming's father, Val, inhaled the same toxic cloud of chlorine gas. And both of them describe the same cloud. And Val is helping my grandfather take out 359 British bodies from the hospital. So that was an extraordinary kind of link. I was linked through Fleming's father, who is also a model for Bond in some ways. And my great uncle, Geoffrey Shakespeare, was literally above Fleming during the first 6 months of the war in room 39, because he was Churchill's parliamentary private secretary, his indefatigable second in command, he was called. And I've been to room 39, Fleming's desk. Literally above the ceiling is Churchill and my uncle Geoffrey. And so for 6 months, they'd have bumped into each other. That also was interesting to me. My son, at the time I was approached by the Fleming estate, was in the same house at school as Fleming had been. There's a Fleming room there. And my son had won Victor Ludorum, the athletics thing, which is what Fleming's proudest achievement at Eton had been. So again, I felt that was kind of signaling me something. 2 more kind of weird coincidences. My mother's father was a very prolific author called S.P.B. Mace, who wrote about 350 books. He had taught the English writer Alec Waugh, the elder brother of Evelyn Waugh, at school at Sherborne. And he brought Alec's book, The Loom of Youth, which was a scandalous book about homosexuality at British public schools. He got it published. Alec Waugh revered him, and he became the godfather of my aunt and everything. And S.P.B. Mace had told Alec Waugh, the key thing for writing, you have to write 2,000 words every morning without fail. You must never leave that regime. Alec Waugh tells Ian Fleming that's the recipe for being a writer. He also gives him the idea for Jamaica, because Alec Waugh goes to Jamaica in the late 1920s and tells him about this amazing bay, Montego Bay, near where Fleming will later end up. But there was a kind of another weird connection, is that my grandfather had talked to Alec Waugh about some ancestors of ours who'd gone out to Jamaica and had sugar plantations, and they'd had a separate family with their workers in Jamaica. And my grandfather always wanted to go and see his black relatives, the Maces, in Jamaica. And he told this to Alec Waugh. Cut to after the war, Alec Waugh now can't get published. Evelyn Waugh's now the great writer. Alec Waugh's lining up his barbiturates to kill himself because his life is over, when he bumps into my grandfather again, who's just met Roger Mace, a black poet from Jamaica, his cousin, and he's full of excitement at this meeting. It plants an idea in Alec Waugh's head to write a novel. He gets the biggest advance from Hollywood for it. Island in the Sun comes out. In Jamaica, the son of Ian Fleming's last girlfriend, Blanche Blackwell, is a 17-year-old music fan. He wants to set up a record company in which we'll do reggae, he'll do Bob Marley. He calls it Island Records after the film of the book. And I talked to Chris Blackwell about this, and he was amazed to think that it had come from my grandfather's story. And Chris Blackwell now owns Goldeneye, where all the Bond books were written. So I thought that was an interesting connection. I have one more connection, which I think your audience will find interesting. My wife is Icelandic Canadian. She said, Bond, well, do you know that William Stevenson, you know about him? And I said, yes, he's the man called Intrepid. He's the quiet Canadian. He was the one person, Ian Fleming said, if there is a model for Bond, it would be William Stevenson, who was my boss in the war. He was the head of intelligence sent by Churchill to New York to set up British intelligence in America, the Caribbean, South America. And it's really between him, William Donovan, and Ian Fleming that the CIA embryo came into being in 1941. Anyway, my wife said, well, he's not actually Canadian, he's Icelandic. And he was given to my family aged 4 as a foundling. And he grew up in the Stefanssons family, my great aunts. And he grew up anglicizing the name Stephenson. And he's actually Icelandic. And it's my father, my own father-in-law, who revealed this to the world in 1980. Because William Stevenson had left Winnipeg in disgrace in 1922, having bankrupted all my father-in-law's patients. He'd taken all their money and invested them in a company fabricating can openers, which had gone bankrupt. And he'd fled Winnipeg in dead of night. On the ship to England, he meets a Tennessee tobacco heiress who he marries. He suddenly has a millionaire access, and he becomes a friend of Churchill, who sends him to New York in 1940. Anyway, I thought this was absolutely gripping, that this man wasn't a Canadian, he wasn't quiet, and he had had a very interesting backstory, and he was named after my wife's family. So in all these together, I said to the Fleming estate, I will write this biography. That's a rather long answer.
Well, I'm just going to write you down as why you just did it on a whim. No, that's amazing. There are so many reasons, but I'll tell you what, Nicholas, you did something that I noticed in the book just now, and that is, I can tell you're not, quote unquote, just a biographer. You're a storyteller. You're a storyteller, and you're a novelist, and you're an author. And the reason I say that is, when I first picked up this book, I thought, all right, this is going to be an encyclopedia of facts, that if I want to go to A or if I want to go to Z, I can look up certain dates. What I found myself doing was being taken up into a story. These weren't just mere facts that were cobbled together sloppily through this. This was amazingly woven through your storytelling skills. In the last 10 minutes, you demonstrated that. But it does beg another question too, because you talked about Fleming's process, the 2,000 words. Do you have a similar process in writing something like that?
I think it's sheer hard work. I mean, I think what I wanted to do, there's so much been written about Fleming, and I thought, is there anything I can learn or say any better than these other biographers have said? And so it wasn't so much the material I found, but it was the shape of his life was slightly different. And so many of the facts were the same, but I found new facts, which is exciting. I mean, since Andrew Lycett's biography in 1995, very dense, full of wonderful stuff. Much more has come out even than then. And we are now able to see him in a slightly we won't find everything. I'm sure there's still cards to play. I mean, I had a very interesting experience. Not knowing him and not really liking him to begin with was very different to my previous experience of writing biography of the writer Bruce Chatwin, who I had known and very much liked and admired. At the end of 7 years, I liked him less. It was the opposite trajectory with Fleming. I didn't like him to begin with. At the end, I felt very sympathetic and admiring of him. And what I would characterize this process is that Fleming, when he fell in love, age 21, 22, with this Swiss woman, Monique Panchaud de Botton, and his mother refused to let him marry her, he carried a candle for Monique for the rest of his life. And she, in a sense, she's a model for many of the Bond girls, a kind of independent, attractive, forthright figure. And he wanted to see her at the end of his life, and she wouldn't see him. She still carried a candle for him. But her son, Monique, went on to marry the man who invented Velcro, which is rather extraordinary, and they had a child. The son, Charles, sent me, extraordinary act of generosity, sent me the photograph that Fleming had given to his mother and that she kept always in a kind of shrine, and several other photographs of Fleming that she had taken and had never been seen before. And he just sent them to me. And I had them on my desk for 4 years. And I would look across the desk and I would look into this man's face, this sardonic old Etonian, veiled in Turkish cigarette smoke, looking at me directly, almost challenging me to discover him, unpick him. And I couldn't. And I did. I went on, I laboriously, right at the end, I glanced across the desk and I suddenly saw him. And I suddenly could penetrate him, I felt. I felt very pleased about that. And I penetrated a much more sympathetic figure, because I think he always found it easier to play the black sheep against his wonderful brother, of whom nothing could be, the brother was like a paragon. And Fleming, in a sense, had to choose to kind of shape himself in opposition to his brother, a bit like Le Carré shapes George Smiley in opposition to James Bond. I mean, Smiley's everything Bond isn't. He's ugly, he's cuckolded, he's morally torn, he's an intellectual, he's middle-aged. Similarly, I think Ian constructed himself in deliberate opposition to his brother as a black sheep in ways that he probably wasn't naturally a black sheep, but he became a black sheep. And so I think at the end, I unpicked that. I felt I'd unpicked him, and I found him a much more sympathetic, damaged figure, but much more sympathetic than I'd hitherto anticipated. And I was rather pleased with that.
I love how your answer around process is less about methodology and a little bit more about how curiosity and discovery is what compels you to move forward and find.
Well, I think you've always got to go. I mean, a novelist, I think, it is often mistaken to be somebody who invents things. And I discovered when I did my last book about Churchill, nonfiction, about Churchill coming to power in 1940, I was astonished at the laziness of historians I came across. So that when I came to do the footnotes and I went back to where I had taken original archives, and sometimes I borrowed from historians, and I went to see where they had borrowed from, 30% of the time they'd mistranscribed from the archives, or they'd elided things to make them actually the opposite of what the original document had. I was quite shocked to the slovenliness of historians. I mean, a novelist is much more accurate about details. I mean, somebody was asking me the other day, what does the novelist in you do to a biography? And I said, well, we use the arsenal of storytelling, the narrative. We've got to keep the reader reading. We're not inventing anything, but we're trying to structure it so that you're going. So I had a lot of short chapters in which I hope you will continue to read on, in which you shape the material within those chapters. But I think further than that, you're interested in motive, in character. And I suddenly realized 2 days ago, I was driving to stay with Ian Fleming's nephew, James Fleming. We were going to be talking in a local church about Fleming, about what is it the novelist brings. And I remember that one of my favorite chapters in this book is where Fleming meets JF Kennedy. And Kennedy asks him for ideas, what you do with Castro, and Fleming gives him ideas which later result in many of them possibly in the Bay of Pigs operation. But I was interested, I spoke to Otzi Leiter, some daughter. Otzi Leiter had taken Fleming that night to dinner in Georgetown with Kennedy in her old house, which Kennedy was living in. And I asked the daughter, what did your mother wear that night? What would, and so she was able to tell me she wore this Givenchy dress with the particular type of jewelry. That suddenly put the character in 3 dimensions. So I wasn't inventing anything. I was just going a step further to try and shimmer the character into a more 3-dimensional reality. I think that's what a novelist does. And so if you very kindly say you're reading, I think I hope because the novelist is bringing something to the story.
You did. And as somebody that's studied Fleming and Bond for, oh gosh, since I was a teenager, it did bring so much more dimensionality, like you're saying, to life. But we've got to talk about Bond because there are quite a few chapters obviously dedicated to Bond. There's one I loved called Bond Fever, for example. You have a very good point that it's really only his latter part of his life, his last 12 years, that is really Bond focused and related. When addressing Bond, I was curious as a writer, how much did you say to yourself, I don't want to make this book about James Bond. I need to make this book about Ian Fleming. How did you delineate the two?
I totally didn't want to make it about Bond. I mean, Bond balls the pants off me in some respects.
What?
I mean, like you, I kind of grew up with Bond, reading him under the blankets with a fading torch and going to the films. But he wasn't somebody who kind of completely captured my passion. And so that probably helped me be dispassionate about this. So, but I knew I didn't want, it seems to me that, as I said earlier, Le Carré has been able to be a custodian of his image. So we think of Le Carré before we think of Smiley. It's the opposite with Fleming and Bond. Bond has submerged his creator like a kind of Frankenstein figure. And so I thought if we're going to be interesting about Fleming, we've got to do this chronologically, and we've got to remind people Bond is an afterthought, and that although Fleming needed to live the life he did in order to write Bond, if he hadn't written Bond, we'd still be interested in Ian Fleming. So I very much wanted not to introduce Bond too much until he starts writing Bond, because otherwise it would, again, swamp the early life, which we need to read about to find out where Bond came from. I mean, I don't shortchange you on telling you where I think this will leak later into Bond, but I'm not kind of rabidly telling you of every Bond connection that happens in Fleming's life, because I think that would, again, swamp Fleming.
Yeah, agreed. In fact, I enjoyed reading about, I'll call it the side effects of Bond, the circumstances of Bond, and how it affected Fleming as an individual, how it affected the family and Anne. That's all in the book for those curious readers out there. And I think that was something new. I have to ask, as a fan of this book, as a fan of you, is there anything on the cutting room floor that you can share? Many authors make cuts, but is there any little tidbit that you could share with us?
Well, there's 50,000 words of tidbits, because when I finally delivered the book, to my horror, only at the last minute did I put all the chapters together. And I was meant to deliver a book of 110,000 words. It was 260,000 words. And I kind of completely panicked. And I said to the publisher, could we have this in 2 volumes? Because it falls into 2 parts, Fleming's war experience and then the post-war experience. And I thought that could work, but they said, no, it's got to be one. But if you shave 50,000 words off, we can probably So I went off to Tasmania and I spent 6 weeks shaving 50,000 words out of this book. I didn't want to cut sever any arteries, so I don't feel there's any top secret thing that's still to come. But there was one story which I really was interested in. I looked at all his Atticus columns for the Sunday Times, and he writes this personal column about himself, and he talks about meeting Albert Camus in recently liberated Paris in October 1944, in a tall flat in the Rue de Rivoli with friends, and he talks to Camus about England. Now, if there's a fly on the wall I would like to be on, it would have been about Fleming talking with Camus in October 1904 in liberated Paris. So yes, I'm sure there's still lots of cards he's got to play. And I'm sure that somebody will find in the National Archives a mislabeled box, which will be top secrets about Ultra or whatever. but or that he's got a whole family of cane workers in Jamaica. I don't know, but I feel I've got as much as I can. Nothing's come out since, by the way. So I feel rather relieved that nobody suddenly produced a dripping head of truth from some other attic.
I cannot believe there would be anything more complete than this. And by the way, my last question is exactly that. I mean, I'm going to go back to the fact that this is called not just Ian Fleming, a biography, it's called The Complete Man. Can you tell my audience members, what did you mean by the complete man? And was he
Well,
ever a complete man?
no, it's a completely ironic. Irony is sometimes lost on the wonderful Americans. It's an ironic
Tell me more.
title. It's an ironic title because he always wanted to be a Renaissance man. He wanted to be a complete man, as he told one of his not a kind of sexual girlfriend, but a girlfriend in the 30s called Mary Pakenham. And she did some amazing kind of recording of some of his conversations. And he would talk about how he wanted to be the Renaissance man, the complete man. And then there's a wonderful journalist called Alan Moorhead, who knew Fleming and who talked about how the war made the average person into a complete man. So I thought that's exactly what it had become for Fleming. He'd become a complete man out of all these disparate parts: the playboy stockbroker, the womanizer, the useless X and Y. The war suddenly coalesces all these different Flemings and brings them into a very substantial figure in which for that period, he's a complete person and probably will spend the rest of his life searching for experiences as intense as that, and will only find them in writing Bond. There's also a wonderful quote I found after the book came out. Adam Sisman, who wrote the biography of Le Carre, sent it to me. It's a quote from Raymond Chandler about going down the mean streets like a complete man. And that too seemed to Fleming was a great admirer of Chandler. Fleming would have known that quote. And in a sense, Fleming writes his best book, From Russia with Love, in response to Chandler saying, come on, you're going off, your books are getting worse and worse, and you could be so much better. And Fleming responding to that by writing From Russia with Love, and that becoming a kind of breakthrough book, if you like. And I felt, yes, the complete man, it works on so many levels because he's trying to be complete. And if you look at his life of 56 years, he's crammed so much into it. So I'm not claiming that he's a Renaissance man, but I'm claiming that's what he wanted to be. And in a sense, in certain areas, he had a very, very full life.
He did indeed. And you painted it beautifully with the strokes of your pen. And we want to thank you for bringing this book to us. And by the way, for those watching right now, we have the link to the book in the comments and description section. Nicholas, in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Well, thank you for listening to me for such long length.
No, I loved it. It was like personal storytelling. I wouldn't have it any other way. In the meantime, this has been David Zaritsky for the Bond Experience, and we'll see you all real soon. Take care. Thanks for watching this episode. If you want to be up on the latest from the Bond Experience, just click on this subscribe and subscribe to our channel. You're going to get all the latest and greatest information, plus some exclusive content. And by the way, speaking of content, here's something especially for you, just because we know you. Talk to you soon.